is that during this kind of brief introduction time, there might have been somebody that said something that really clicked with you. So now we're going to take a few minutes and give you a chance to meet with that person and fill up with some food so that we can just totally concentrate on what Dr. Botkin has to say to us in about, can we say, 15 minutes? Can we do it in that short of time? Sure. What we've been waiting for so long. I first heard about Dr. Alan Botkin from Pam Kircher when she came into town as our guest speaker last spring. She and I arranged to meet with him, and I read the article he had written in the Journal for Near-Death Studies, and I was blown away, just absolutely blown away. I didn't believe this could be possible. But we talked to him, and I began to realize that it was possible. And I subsequently had my own experience, which we might have time for later. Some of you have heard it. And I know that it's real and it's true. He is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist at the VA hospital. The people he works with are very often, probably most of the time, pretty well traumatized from something or another, from war or from whatever it is. And he just happened across this technique. He will tell you about that, so I don't want to go into that. But we are very blessed to have him with us today, and I know that you're going to enjoy it. Please welcome Dr. Botkin.
I'd like to try to do this without the microphone. Can everybody hear me okay? Everybody in the back? If my voice goes down and you start to have a hard time, raise your hand, point to your ear so I know what's going on, okay? It's very much an honor for me to be here talking to the Chicago chapter of IANDS. A very interesting group of people. It was nice for me to hear your stories as we went around the room. And it's nice to know that there are some psychologists and psychotherapists here, and at least one of you is EMDR trained, right? Two, that's right. I especially want to thank Diane. She's been such a wonderful supporter of my work, and what a wonderful person she is. And her life's mission is an important one. I really believe that. The best way for me to explain all of this, I think, is to kind of take you through some of the steps that led me up to this discovery. When I graduated from Baylor University in 1983 with a Doctor of Psychology degree, my theoretical orientation was behavioral. I strongly believed that the behaviorist movement was the way to go. I did my undergraduate training at the University of Kansas in the 60s, late 60s, where some of the most radical behaviorists in the world were at the time. We were very proud of the fact that we were only interested in observables. We didn't want to deal with anything about state of mind or anything we had to infer. We prided ourselves on being very scientific. Well, with my first job at North Chicago VA, I got a job working on the PTSD unit, post-traumatic stress disorder. People with PTSD suffer from recurring traumatic memories of a traumatic event. Their problems had to do with something going on inside their head. I had to change my behavioral ways. And I'm going to take you through some of the steps. PTSD is a very complex disorder, but perhaps the most important aspect of it is the re-experiencing of the traumatic event. People who have been traumatized, in the case of Vietnam veterans, they were traumatized over 30 years ago. The nature of a traumatic memory is such that when you remember the event, you not only remember it, you also relive it. So for these Vietnam vets that I work with, when they remember their traumas over 30 years ago, it doesn't feel like 30 years ago. It feels like yesterday. But anyway, I've learned a lot of lessons. A lot of lessons I didn't learn in graduate school. Much of it was on the job training. Probably one of the main lessons that I learned is that anytime someone presents a traumatic memory, I go through a certain thinking process, and I'm going to show you what that is. It's very simple. When it comes to treating trauma, at least combat trauma, which is what I mostly do, when someone presents a traumatic memory, the first thing I do is decide what kind of trauma it is. There are only two kinds of traumas in the whole wide world. There are fear traumas and loss traumas. In a fear trauma, a person experiences fear that he or someone else may get hurt or die. In a loss trauma, the only difference is somebody actually dies. Okay? Now, I'm primarily a PTSD person, and I got into the whole thing of treating grief sort of by default, because many of my patients clearly were grieving the loss of people close to them, in addition to having the usual traumatic symptoms. So, the first decision I make is what kind of trauma is it? Of course, many traumas have both these components. All right? But I'm going to ignore the fear trauma for now, and I'm going to talk about a loss trauma. What I've learned over the years is that feelings come in layers. When somebody dies, when it's a loss trauma, these are the typical layers that one encounters. Anger, guilt, and sadness. Sadness is the core issue, and for anybody to make peace with a loss, whether it's a traumatic variety or more standard grief, one must eventually process the core feelings of sadness to achieve any kind of peace and acceptance. When the person presents a traumatic loss, though, usually these layers come with it. Typically, what I do is I have a combat veteran present a trauma in a group format, and then we go sit down and do individual therapy. Typically, let's take the example that the patient's best friend, buddy, dies in a combat situation. He gets shot and he gets killed. When the veteran reports this trauma and explains this trauma in group, what I'm always interested in is what kind of feelings he's in touch with. And generally it goes something like this. Ask him how he feels. Well, I'm angry. I'm angry at the U.S. government that put us in that awful situation, and I'm angry at my lieutenant, the officer that put us in this situation that got my buddy killed. Oftentimes when a vet first presents, that's the only emotion that he experiences. Now, back in the old days, when I refer to old days, I mean before EMDR or eye movement came along. The process usually went something like this. After processing the anger for sometimes weeks, even months, we sometimes were able to get to a deeper level, a level of guilt. And the thinking with the guilt is different. The thinking is now, it's not my lieutenant's fault, or it's not my government's fault my buddy died, it's my fault. He stuck his head up in a firefight and was shot and killed. I told him 15 times to keep your head down in a firefight. he stuck his head up and got killed. It's my fault. If I'd told him 16 times, he might still be alive today. Of course, the only problem with this is with the standard talk therapy we were using at the time, is when the anger turned into guilt, the patient became depressed. It's not his fault anymore, it's my fault. And I would come up to him and I'd say, hey, way to go, you're doing a good job, you're making progress. And he would look at me. I feel worse. This doesn't feel like progress. And he would find something to get angry at, and he'd jump back up. From time to time, we would be able to break through these two outer layers and get to the core sadness. And of course, the core sadness is where the real pain resides. Anger actually feels good. This starts to hurt. And here's where the deep pain resides. And oftentimes in the course of doing our talk therapy, a patient would begin to access that deep sadness, and he'd find anything he could to do to jump out of it. I used to do groups. I'd have like 8 or 9 combat veterans sitting in this group, and somebody would start to access their sadness, which would trigger everybody sitting in the room. They'd all start to feel that deep sadness. And then somebody in the group would have the bright idea of figuring out something they could get angry at. Did you see that person when we walked in? Did she mistreat you like, did she disrespect you like she did me? Yeah, she did. Yeah. Everybody'd get mad. Right? And everybody got out of their sadness. Of course, the problem is before eye movement, once we got to the sadness, there wasn't much we could do with it. The idea was, the longer you expose yourself to that deep core pain, eventually it will begin to subside. In a safe environment. Well, it sort of did. On a scale of 10, where 10 is the most sadness a person can experience and 0 is no sadness at all, we could sometimes get a 10 down to a 7. And then an anniversary time of the year would come up, and it would jump right back up to a 10. We were pretty much spinning our wheels for years. I've been working in PTSD for 8 or 9 years when eye movement came along. Eye movement changed everything. We found that with EMDR, we could cut through these layers sometimes in a single session. Get through the anger. There's the guilt. We keep hammering away. We get down to the sadness. And if the patient was able and willing to maintain access to that sadness, and if we continued to eye move that person, we were done. Sometimes we could do that in a single session. Now this was standard eye movement. I'm going to make a distinction between standard eye movement and some things I started to do differently. Generally, eye movement is taught that you generally put aside 90 minutes for the session. And you generally follow the patient's associations. Whatever the patient brings up, that's what you eye move, and you go where he or she goes. So sometimes in an hour and a half session, if the patient was able and willing to keep his foot on the gas, and we got to that core sadness and we eye moved it, we were done. It was amazing. It changed everything. It changed the way we did business. We were so happy. We tried to be professional, but we'd be sitting there and we'd get this wonderful result that we hadn't seen for years. And we'd congratulate the patient, so on and so forth, and we'd go running in another psychologist's office, and I got another one. We'd high-five each other. We felt wonderful about this. All right?
Would you explain eye movement?
I will. Okay. Actually, that's what I was going to say next. If you came here to learn how to do eye movement on yourself, you're going to be disappointed. Eye movement is an extremely powerful technique. We strongly discourage all our patients and clients to not try it on themselves. I used to think when eye movement first came out, all you did was wave your finger or stick in front of somebody's face and they got better. I thought the procedure was idiot-proof. I thought this would make any psychotherapist great. But actually, over the years, I've changed my mind considerably. Back in the old days, with the old talk therapy, it was kind of like an old jalopy going around a racetrack. It would break down from time to time, and you'd be stuck on the road. Sometimes you'd accidentally put it in reverse and start going the wrong way. Took years and years. Eye movement, though, it's so powerful, it's kind of like now you're driving that same racetrack, only you have a car that can do 240 miles an hour. You better know what you're doing when you're using it. And those of you who have used eye movement know the power of it. You need to know what you're doing. Even if you know what you're doing, it's not even a good idea for a professional eye mover to eye move him or herself. Have somebody else do it. You need somebody else to properly guide the experience. Generally, the technique involves a shifting of the eyes back and forth in a particular rhythmic fashion. I've used only the eye movement when I've used this procedure. However, any kind of bilateral stimulation also works. Some people use auditory stimulation, bilateral auditory stimulation. There's tactile. There's different ways of doing it. Generally, people I know who use eye movement say that the moving of the eyes works a little bit better, although you can still get excellent results by using the other forms of bilateral stimulation. I believe that the discoverer of EMDR, Dr. Francine Shapiro, discovered this in the mid to late 80s. And as the story goes, she was walking through the park one day, being troubled by some reoccurring negative thoughts. For some reason, she began to shift her eyes back and forth. She noticed that the intrusive nature of these thoughts and these thoughts themselves kind of dissipated. It surprised her. From there, she went to and did the procedure on a number of her colleagues and got the same result. She went on from there to publish 2 very important papers that came out in, I believe, 87 and 89. Her model, I believe, is correct. Although at first I didn't buy it, having a hard time giving up my old cognitive behavioral ideas. Her model is one of accelerated information processing. And that certainly fits clinical experience. It just seems to speed things up. In the course of doing eye movement, people generally go through the same steps, A, B, C, D. Those steps in talk therapy can take months and years to get from A to D. Sometimes in the course of doing eye movement, it's A, B, C, D right then and there. What makes sense to me, although this isn't scientifically validated or empirically validated, is comparing eye movement to REM sleep. When we sleep, when we dream that is, our eyes dart back and forth, rapid eye movement. When we're dreaming, our brain is in a higher processing mode than when we're awake. The discovery of eye movement seems to me to be that if you physically get a person moving his or her eyes back and forth while wide awake, it puts the brain into that high processing mode, and you can use that. In 1995, North Chicago VA went through some major reorganization, and we battled some of the administrators there. Some of the administrators thought that we were paying too much attention to trauma work, We weren't curing anybody. So some of these administrators stuck their nose in our offices and said, hey, instead of focusing on trauma work, why don't you tell them to forget about their traumas and teach them job skills and how to act normal? Well, a lot of the patients and clients I work with have dealt with people like that throughout their lives, which in those kind of statements, of course, indicate that they know nothing about post-traumatic stress disorder. People have these memories on a regular basis because they intrude, not because they choose to have them. But anyway, I made the argument, and successfully, I'm happy to say, that the problem was that we weren't doing too much trauma work, we weren't doing near enough. Many of the patients I was working with had as many as 30 and 40 traumatic memories. In the course of one hospital stay, some of these guys were lucky if they'd get through 2 or 3 of them. So we were just scratching the surface. So with the support of the chief of psychology at the time, Linda's old pal, Dr. Lips, he supported me in beginning this, starting this new program, the ITP, or Intensive Trauma Program. The idea of this program was that we would focus exclusively on traumatic memories. Whereas the other track in the program, patient got a little bit of everything. Life skills training, substance abuse, and so on and so forth. Assertiveness training. And the trauma work they did in the other program was maybe constituted 20%, 20 to 30% of what they did. In my ITP program, that's all we did was trauma work all day long. And it basically involved, again, a shifting from a presentation in group to an individual eye movement session. So by the time the ITP, I got that started, we had been doing eye movement for 3 or so years. Having my own program gave me a chance to experiment with a number of variations on the EMDR. I remember going home thinking, oh, I got a great idea. If I do this, maybe this will happen. It almost never worked. 95% of all my brilliant ideas went down the tube. I did find a couple things, though, that worked very well. One is I have patients close their eyes after each set of eye movement. And the reason I started doing that is some of my patients I was working with, after giving them a set of eye movements, they just spontaneously closed their eyes, a small percentage. Those that did that got a much better response. So I started instructing all my patients to close their eyes after each set of eye movement, and they all started getting a much better response. The other big change I made in eye movement, and this is critical, is I do what I call core focused EMDR. And what that means is I completely ignore these outer levels, these outer layers. And I target the core issue, whether it be fear or sadness, with each trauma. And it usually goes something like this. Let's say the vet presents the trauma I described before. We lost a buddy in a firefight. After presenting that trauma, I'll ask him what kind of feelings come up. I'm angry. I'm angry at my lieutenant. He got my friend killed. What else? Well, I feel guilty too. Doesn't want to go there. Anger's always the easiest. Anything else? No. How about sadness? You lost your best friend that day. Well, yes, that too. If the patient is able to access sadness even to that tiniest degree, when we sit down and go to do the eye movement, I go right after it. I'm much more directive in my eye movement approach than the way it's taught for you eye movement people out there. I don't allow them to talk about their anger and their guilt or whatever. I explain to them ahead of time that what we do is not talk therapy, nor is it standard EMDR therapy. What we are going to do is a procedure. And you know, it's really not a psychological technique. It's really a physiological technique. So my patient comes in and sits down. Okay, Charlie, bring up your sadness. Got it? Yeah. On a scale of 10, where are you, Charlie? How much sadness? 4. All right. I give him the first set of eye movement. What happens?
Feels worse.
The sadness goes through the ceiling. The EMDR does 2 things better than anything else. Number 1 is it uncovers material better than anything else. And in my experience, it does a much better job of that than hypnosis. And it does it much more rapidly. So, he's accessing his sadness. I give him some eye movement, and his 4 is now a 10. And here come the tears. I start shaking. He's all the way, he's in the core, as we say. His job, which I explained before we sit down and do this, is his job is to keep his foot on the gas. Let me do the steering. Keep your foot on the gas. Don't bail out on me now. Don't leave me now. Because with the if I get his sadness all the way up to a 10, with the next set of eye movement, it starts to come down. We got to get it all the way accessed, but once it's fully accessed, now it's ready to come down. Which is the second thing eye movement does better than anything else. It desensitizes, or takes the reliving component out of the memory. So, sadness is here, first set of eye movement, and then it'll start to come down, and sometimes it only takes 2, 3 sets. And we're done. Sometimes it takes only 15, 20 minutes. And the 20 minutes includes writing a note with the patient sitting there. We're done. Why are we done? We go back and look for the anger and guilt. Where is it? It's gone. Why is it gone?
More sadness.
Because we fully processed the sadness. These outer layers serve a protective function. It protects one from feeling his or her deepest pain. That's what they're there for. That's why they get angry in group when they start to get sad, to protect themselves. Not all patients are able and willing to do this kind of approach that I do in my intensive program. They're very thoroughly screened. The very last thing we want to do is get them in there and get them into the core and have them bail out. Because if they bail out and quit at that point, they're in a very bad place. They've got to have the ability to keep their foot on the gas. So, things started really moving now. But, something else unusual happened. I would say 15% of the time that I did this core focused eye movement, the patient, when opening his eyes, and I say his because I work with males, said that he saw or talked to the deceased person he was grieving. First time this happened, I was like, what? I'd never heard of these. I'd heard of near-death experiences and talked to many patients who had that. I thought my patient snapped under pressure the first time I'd heard this. I made the same mistake many professional people do. Well, he must have just hallucinated, because I don't know what that was. Matter of fact, I want to read to you the very first time this happened. I want to read it so I don't leave anything out. On the day I first discovered the IADC phenomenon, that's induced after-death communication, I was in a psychotherapy session with Sam. I handed him a box of Kleenex as tears ran down his face and dropped from his chin onto his shirt. I had worked with Sam, a 46-year-old patient at the VA hospital, on other traumatic memories of his Vietnam War experience, but he had avoided bringing up this one because it was too painful. While in Vietnam, he had developed a very close relationship with Lee, a 10-year-old orphan Vietnamese girl. She had made Sam's base camp her home after both of her parents were killed in the war. She helped with daily chores on the base, and in return was given food, shelter, and companionship. The other American soldiers watched out for her, but Sam and Lee developed a special relationship. Lee reminded Sam of his younger sisters, helping him maintain a sense of his own humanity amid the dehumanizing brutality of the war. Each time Sam's unit returned from his patrols in the jungle, Lee would pick him out of the group and run up to him and give him a hug. Other soldiers in Sam's unit became accustomed to seeing the two of them together and talking about their lives before they met. Lee particularly enjoyed stories about life in America. After several months, Sam decided to adopt Lee and bring her home. However, orders came down from headquarters that all orphan Vietnamese children on the base were to be sent to a Catholic orphanage in a distant village. Sam was devastated. A few days later, Sam, in tears, helped load Lee and other orphan Vietnamese children onto a flatbed truck, which was going to take them to the orphanage. Just as they got all of the children onto the truck, shots rang out and bullets zipped into the truck. Risking their lives, Sam and the other soldiers quickly pulled the children off the truck to the relative safety of the ground. The shooting stopped as quickly as it had started, and they began to put the children back onto the truck. Nearly all of the children were back on the truck when Sam realized he didn't see Lee. He walked to the back of the truck and saw her lying face down with a spot of blood on her back. Sam rolled her over and was horrified to see that the front of her torso had been blown open from the impact of a single bullet. Lee was dead. Sam sat on the ground holding her lifeless body and cried. Other soldiers had to pull Sam away and take Lee's body to bury her. The incident caused Sam's psychological undoing. For the remainder of his tour in Vietnam, he numbed the pain of his profound loss with anger and rage, volunteering for dangerous patrols to kill any enemy he could find or be killed himself. After Vietnam, he returned to the States and fathered a daughter of his own, but avoided her for years because she triggered anger, guilt, and deep sadness over Lee's death, as well as gruesome images of Lee's dead body. For nearly 25 years, Sam spent most of his days secluded alone in the basement of his home, separated physically and psychologically from his family. At that point, I offered him EMDR. I had been using EMDR for about 6 years to treat my patients suffering from intrusive memories of traumatic events. The procedure involves having, I've been through that. Nearly all psychologists familiar with the procedure believe it to be the psychological breakthrough of our time. Our inpatient unit was one of the first facilities in the country to use this technique on a regular basis. And we were astonished by the results. For the first time, we were able to do much more than help our patients learn to live with their pain. We could significantly decrease it, often very rapidly, as I pointed out before. Sam sobbed quietly from the overwhelming pain of his grief. I asked him to focus on his sadness and administered the first set of eye movements. As I expected, the sadness that had held him isolated in grief for 25 years initially increased dramatically. I quickly gave him more sets of eye movement, and his sadness began to decrease. With tears still running down his face, I administered a final set of eye movements and asked him to close his eyes. Neither of us were prepared for what happened next. The tears that had been flowing from his eyes suddenly stopped, and he smiled broadly. He giggled slightly. He opened his eyes and was euphoric. He said, "When I closed my eyes, I saw Lee as a beautiful woman with long black hair and a white gown surrounded by radiant light. She seemed genuinely happier and more content than anyone I have ever known. Sam's face, still reddened from tears, glowed. He continued, "She thanked me for taking care of her before she died. I said, 'I love you, Lee,' and she said, 'I love you too, Sam.' And she put her arms around me and hugged me. And then she faded away." Sam was ecstatic and absolutely convinced that he had just communicated with Lee. "I could actually feel her arms around me," he said. And of course, as I told you before, I wasn't sure what to make out of this. I figured it had been Sam had just hallucinated and that the results wouldn't hold up over time. When I saw Sam a few days later, he was still feeling good about his experiential reconnection, and he was still smiling. As a matter of fact, he wanted to talk about Lee, a conversation that he had avoided for many years. I was even more surprised when I saw him about a month later and he still felt the same way. Actually, I talked to Sam about a year ago and he still feels the same way. As a matter of fact, I think I can say the results with this induced experience seem to hold up over time in every case, although I've done no formal studies. Most of our patients do return to the unit, if not for further treatment on additional memories. They frequently stop by just to say hello. After this had happened a number of times, I thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice if more of my patients could have this experience? If I could improve upon the 15%. So I went back and looked at the cases in which the experience occurred, and I looked at those in which it didn't occur. And I was able to see that in the cases that occurred, I did go through a particular sequence of psychotherapeutic events. Primarily, what I did in these cases, in addition to doing the core focused EMDR approach on the sadness, I also gave them a set of eye movement and told them just to go with whatever happened. Sometimes I said something like that just to let them relax some more. What I figured I was doing is I was giving eye movement to enhance the psychological state of receptivity, which allows this experience to occur. After-death communications are not new. I had never heard of them at the time. Many of you have had these experiences. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit now, or in a minute. So technically, I don't use the eye movement to directly induce the experience. I use the eye movement to induce a state that allows the experience to naturally occur. Okay? Now I'm going to talk a little bit about after-death communications, at least the spontaneous variety. ADCs happen all the time, or are happening all the time with a large percentage of people. Oops, before I do that, I want to read the case of when I first intentionally induced an ADC. So this was my first shot at it, knowing that the enhancement of the receptive mode was what I needed to do. So this was the first time I intentionally did that. I attempted to induce the experience with a patient named Gary. Gary had lost his daughter when she was 13 years old. She had been severely oxygen deprived at birth and never developed mentally beyond the abilities of a 6-month-old child. Gary loved her dearly and included her in activities whenever he could. He often took her dancing because she loved music. One evening, Gary and his wife went out for dinner without their daughter. On the drive home, they passed an ambulance going in the opposite direction. When they arrived home, they discovered that their daughter was in the ambulance and had suffered a severe heart attack. They rushed to the hospital where they learned that her heart had stopped beating for some time and that she had been placed on life support. After a few weeks, she showed some signs that she could breathe on her own, so Gary and his wife made the difficult decision of trying to take her off the respirator. The day she was taken off the respirator, she struggled to breathe, but then died in Gary's arms. Gary sat in my office crying softly as he finished telling me the story. I explained the new procedure to him and the results other patients had achieved. He was interested in giving it a try. But he was sure it wouldn't work for him because he was an atheist and he didn't believe in such things. I first used core-focused EMDR to reduce his overwhelming sadness. Then I asked him to think of his daughter in a general way and go with whatever happened. He closed his eyes and sat quietly for a few minutes. Then he opened his eyes with a look of amazement. I saw my daughter playing happily in a beautiful garden, alive with rich and radiant colors. She looked healthy and seemed to move around without the physical problems she had when alive. He continued with surprise and delight. She looked at me and I could feel her love for me. We talked more about his experience. Gary was convinced that his daughter was still alive, although in a very different place. Because he still felt sad because he missed her, I induced the experience again, asking him to keep that thought in mind. Gary closed his eyes. After a few moments, he opened his eyes with a smile. I was in the garden again, and I could see her. She was looking at me. She said to me, "I'm still with you, Daddy." He paused. That was really wonderful, you know. She couldn't talk when she was alive. Gary ended the session feeling joyous and reconnected with his daughter. He reported to me 1 year later that he continued to feel reconnected to his daughter. He was also convinced that, quote, people really don't die, they just take on a form and live in a different place, which is very beautiful. How are we doing?
Okay, you've got an hour and 20 minutes.
What?
Yes.
I knew I had to move quickly. All right. Oh. By the way, I've never had a near-death experience. I'd love to have one, though. I thought of maybe taking up bungee jumping. I have had a few induced ADCs. One I did on myself, and a colleague did another one. And I choose not to get into that. Both of them are pretty personal. But anyway, I have had the experience. And both were surprising. Each experience was very different and very different from what I expected, which is really a hallmark of whether a person actually has an ADC or not. Nearly all cases, when I induce the experience, they're nearly always extremely surprised. That's not what I expected. I thought he or she'd say this or do this. It's always different, which is one of the main arguments, and I'm not going to get into it too much today, why I think that really psychological theories don't hold up. And to induce the experience, you need to put all expectations and beliefs and so on aside. And the people that say, it's not going to work with me, Dr. Al, I don't believe in those kind of things, as you saw with Gary, actually those people are easier to induce because they more readily get into the receptive mode. They're not trying to make something happen. People that are devoutly religious, whether it's more traditional or even more New Age beliefs, when you sit down with them, they try to create an experience that's consistent with their beliefs. And when you do that, nothing happens. All right? Again, it's the receptive mode. You got to quiet all those other psychological functions.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's so interesting is that all of the work that he does is consistent with everything I've read about near-death experiences. The people that come back show that they've been changed by life review. They show a greater knowledge of what they've done, and it's enormously healing. Tell them about the Army guy who's, I mean, no, not Army guy, the guy whose father beat him up.
Oh, yeah, I'll get to that at the end. Otherwise, I'll get a little confused.
Yeah. Great.
Of course, when my patients first started having these experiences, as I said before, I had no idea what was happening. I was aware of NDE phenomenon, and many of the components were the same, so I thought maybe my guys were hallucinating, but at the same time, they sounded very familiar. I was not aware that ADC, or after-death communications, occurs spontaneously with lots of people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about spontaneous ADCs and talk about some of the difference between those and induced ADCs. At least 4 books have been published recently on the phenomenon of spontaneous after-death communications. Probably the most well-known is Hello from Heaven by the Guggenheims. How many are familiar with that work? Okay. They published Hello from Heaven in 1995, which has been on the bestseller list for some time. The most remarkable aspect of this book to me was that the 353 personal accounts of spontaneous ADCs in their book were nearly identical to the descriptions that my patients were giving me. Spontaneous ADCs take many forms, ranging from sudden appearance of butterflies to the perception of an actual conversation with the deceased. After studying over 3,300 accounts of spontaneous ADCs in their ADC project, the Guggenheims developed a list of 12 types of spontaneous ADC, 12 categories. And I'll take you through these just so you're familiar with them. Number 1, sentient ADCs are the most common. They involve sensing or feeling the presence of the deceased. The Guggenheims describe these spontaneous ADCs as the least tangible and most subtle form of ADC. Number 2, auditory ADCs. The experiencer hears the voice of the deceased or receives a verbal message. Number 3, tactile ADCs involve feeling a physical touch from the deceased, and these are relatively less common. Olfactory ADCs are also relatively common. The experiencer smells a fragrance associated with the deceased. Visual ADCs involve seeing the deceased. They are common and dramatic compared to the other forms of ADC. ADC visions are also visual, but involve bright, vivid colors that radiate their own inner light. The experiencer perceives them either with eyes open or closed. These ADCs may include some form of two-way communication. It is less common than the other forms. Twilight ADCs occur just as people are falling asleep or waking up. Any combination of the other ADCs can be involved in this rather fairly common ADC experience. For those of you who are familiar with the idea of the hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations, that's what they're saying, that they frequently occur during those states. But very different from dream material. Sleep state ADCs occur when the person is asleep. They are very common and can take on a variety of forms. Those who experience the ADCs during sleep insist that their experiences are very different from dreams. ADCs are experienced as much clearer than dreams, and the memory of the experience does not fade over time as memories of most dreams do. In my experience, I've had hundreds of spontaneous ADCs reported to me, and in my experience, an overwhelming majority occurred during sleep. But each and every person who has this experience will tell you it's very different from a dream. Out-of-body or OBE ADCs, number 9, are less common and involve contact with the deceased while the survivor is in an out-of-body state. Some of these ADCs are very NDE-like and include going through a tunnel towards light before meeting the deceased. Now this next one, when I first heard this, I just thought it was weird. Telephone ADCs. Although I can't smile at it anymore. Somebody on my website wrote in and said that they had experienced a telephone ADC. Telephone ADCs take place either when the person is awake or asleep. When the person is asleep, they are similar to sleep state ADCs. However, some people have reported actually receiving a phone call from the deceased while awake. Telephone ADCs are the least common form of ADC. I guess if that's the only way they can get your attention, they'll do anything.
Have there been any email ones yet?
No, nor have the deceased showed up during TV commercials. I expect the emails will be coming eventually. ADCs of physical phenomena are rather common and involve unusual physical events that survivors perceive are messages from the deceased. Examples are a light being turned on or off, or a door being opened or closed. Symbolic ADCs are common and involve seeing something in the physical environment that survivors interpret as a sign from the deceased, such as the appearance of butterflies or rainbows. The Guggenheims agree with other researchers, and that's all 12 by the way, the Guggenheims agree with other researchers that ADCs greatly accelerate the grieving process. The remarkable healing associated with these experiences is now clear to most professionals working with patients who suffer from grief and loss. It seems clear that we are talking about the same phenomena. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the difference between spontaneous ADCs and induced ADCs. The most prominent difference between spontaneous ADCs and induced ADCs is that in spontaneous ADCs, the experience is unexpected. The experiencer does not anticipate having the experience, and does not participate in allowing it to happen. In an induced ADC, a psychotherapist helps the experiencer to enter into a receptive mode that allows the ADC to occur. As I said before, and this is critical, the psychotherapist does not create the ADC, or even influence its direction. The role of the psychotherapist is simply to aid the experiencer to come to an open, receptive state of mind so an ADC will occur naturally. From that point on, the content is generally experienced as unexpected, just as the content of spontaneous ADCs. There are three important differences between spontaneous ADCs and induced ADCs. The first, number one, the Guggenheims and others who have written books on spontaneous ADCs state that spontaneous ADCs always occur spontaneously and that they cannot be induced. One author even said that we will probably never be able to do that. Of course, with the IADC approach, we have proven that that's wrong. Number two, induced ADCs are much more elaborate, richer in content, and more multisensory than most spontaneous ADCs. Induced ADCs are never inferred or vague, as are sentient, physical, and symbolic ADCs, and nearly always involve a combination of the sensory experiences present in visual, auditory, and tactile ADCs. Number three, IADCs not only accelerate the grieving process as spontaneous ADCs do, but in nearly all cases, the more extensive, controlled nature of the induced experience completely resolves grief. A result much stronger than the effects of most spontaneous ADCs. If all issues are not resolved in an induced ADC, it's a rather simple matter to immediately induce the experience again, while having the subject attend to what is not yet resolved. Any additional leftover issues rapidly resolved with the next induction in nearly all cases. The procedure can easily be repeated until all issues are fully resolved. For example, in the induced ADC that I discussed earlier with Gary, who lost his daughter, he still felt some sadness because he still missed his daughter because she wasn't there. It was a simple matter simply to have him hold that thought in mind and induce the experience again, at which point his daughter came back to him and spoke to him and let him know that she was still with him. Okay? By the way, I am saving time for questions, so you'll get a chance, I hope. As I said before, when my patients first started having these experiences spontaneously in the course of the EMDR, I wasn't sure what to make out of it. And as I said before, many of the components of my patients' experiences were very similar to the components of NDEs. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the comparison of IADCs and NDEs now. When I first read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, many years ago, I was very skeptical that an NDE was anything more than some sort of psychological or physiologically based hallucination. You've all heard that before, right? I enjoyed your presentation earlier.
Yes, heard it and read it too.
I had never heard of NDEs before. Now this goes all the way back to the 70s. I've talked to many folks that have had NDEs since then. But Dr. Moody, of course, made the point that people who have NDEs generally do not share their experience with others unless asked, because they learn rather quickly that other people tend to dismiss their experience as a symptom of temporary insanity. So I began to ask. Not only did I discover that the experience is rather common, I was very surprised to find out that those who had the experience were absolutely convinced that the experience was real. Since then, I've probably talked to over 800 people. I could add about 40 more now. People have had NDEs. Most of these reports provided by people who were normal, psychologically healthy individuals. My initial skepticism had been challenged over and over again by the personal conviction with which these people related their experiences. And when my patients first started reporting IADCs, I, as I said, immediately realized that much of the content was similar. I'm going to talk about 6 components of NDEs that have very close similarity to IADC experiences. First, I'm going to go over out-of-body experiences, seeing the deceased as whole, functioning, and healthy, feeling of peace and well-being, going through a tunnel towards light, meeting the deceased, beautiful landscapes, and life review. First, with regard to out-of-body experiences. NDE experiencers frequently report an out-of-body experience, often floating above their physical bodies, watching medical technicians try to revive them. IADC experiencers do not report out-of-body experiences, and I haven't had one yet. But they frequently do report going back to the scene of death of the person for whom they are grieving and witness the soul or spirit leaving the body. These experiences occur most frequently when there is no personal relationship between the survivor and the deceased, such as in cases that involve a hospital or battlefield death. In these experiences, the survivor spontaneously goes back to the time of death during the induced ADC and witnesses the spirit of the dying person leave. I want to read an example of one of these kind of experiences. Bob and his unit had set up camp for the night in Vietnam. He and his two buddies had guard duty and were ordered to shoot anything that moved outside their perimeter. Later that night, they detected movement in the bush not far from their position. All three opened fire, and it appeared that they hit whoever or whatever it was. That morning, they all went out and discovered that they had shot and killed a Vietnamese woman and her infant. The woman was unarmed and for some unknown reason had wandered close to their camp. At the time, Bob was enraged at the senselessness of what had happened. For many years since the incident, Bob suffered from daily intrusive images of their dead bodies and an intense feeling of both anger and sadness. When Bob explained his memory in our psychotherapy session, his primary feeling was overwhelming sadness. I performed the ADC procedure first to reduce the intensity of his emotions. As he closed his eyes to focus on his sadness, Bob spontaneously went back to the moment that the mother and child were killed. Although he didn't see their bodies until the next morning in his IADC, he saw what looked like the spirits of the woman and child rise out of their bodies at the moment they died. The mother held her child in her arms, turned, and drifted through a large tunnel towards a bright light. They had a very peaceful look on their faces and appeared to move toward the light with a sense of purpose. Bob opened his eyes and told me about his experience. He said, "I feel like my sadness has been replaced by real happiness." He was greatly comforted by his perception that life continued for the mother and child, as well as his feeling that the mother and child had maintained their loving relationship. He believed that his experience proved that there is life after death. Bob was somewhat confused, however, by the appearance of the bright light during his IADC, because at the time of the incident, it was totally dark. Bob was completely unaware of NDEs and knew nothing of the consistent theme in NDEs of seeing a bright light and a tunnel. A month later, after Bob had successfully worked through another issue, he ended psychotherapy. At that time, he no longer felt any sadness about the incident, and all associated negative images also disappeared. Which is another real nice thing about this whole IADC approach, which I really kind of didn't get into at all, but it deserves mentioning. In addition to resolving the grief or the deep core sadness, once a person has an ADC, the typical intrusive negative images, feelings, sensations also vanish. Frequently, people are troubled by an awful, bloody kind of scene that continues to return. After the ADC image, that negative scene is gone in many cases. Many guys will say, I'm trying to think of what that looked like. I can't even bring it up anymore, which is real surprising given the fact that it's been in their face for 30 years. Guys say things like, I can only see her smiling right now. Okay. Another similarity between IADCs and NDEs is seeing the deceased as whole, functioning, and healthy. NDE experiencers describe the loved ones they see who have passed away as being whole, healthy, even if they were impaired and disabled during life. Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper completed a study of NDEs among blind people, reporting that the blind are commonly able to see during their NDEs, even those who have been blind since birth. IADC experiencers also experience the deceased as no longer attached to the physical bodies they left behind. People who are very old or ill before death are always experienced as younger and healthier. Children who die young are frequently experienced as older. Sometimes they're older and sometimes they're not. And I have no good idea why that happens. If some of you have a theory on that, let me know. Those with disabilities in life are always described as free from the limitations they had in life. A face that appeared worry-worn always looks peaceful and serene. Taking this one step further, I'm going to throw in another case at this point. I've been doing ADCs for a number of years, and I and my colleagues have probably induced over probably 3,000 ADCs at this point. But after I've been doing a number of years, and the disabled always appeared in the ADC as healthy, and they could talk where they couldn't talk before, and so on and so forth. I had one patient who had a number of IADC experiences with me, and he came to me one day and he said, and he was discussing his severely retarded son, who was microcephalic, and he was like 20 years old and had the mental age of like 3 months. Very severely retarded, still in diapers and so on. And I forget who suggested it, whether it was me or the patient, but the question came up, could we contact the son now? He's not dead, he's alive, but given the fact that the deceased are always experienced as not having the limitations in life, maybe there's a soul or a spirit somewhere right now that's healthy. Let's give it a shot. And indeed it worked. His son came to him without the cranial deformities that go with microencephaly. But he could also speak. And he thanked my patient for being such a wonderful father. And he said, don't worry about me. He said, I have it the best because I live in both worlds. So he's over there, and mostly over there and partly here, I guess. Ever since that experience, and he would go home to see his son, he said, I look at him all different now. I wonder what he's really thinking. Feeling of peacefulness and well-being. Virtually all of those who have had NDEs report a feeling of peacefulness and well-being for themselves. Those who have an IADC experience report the feeling of happiness and contentment NDE experiencers described as though it somehow has been transmitted from the deceased to them. When this occurs, the pain the survivor brings to the experience immediately vanishes. For the IADC patient, experiencing the deceased in such a profoundly positive emotional state does much to expedite the resolution of grief. Going through a tunnel and towards light. People who experience NDEs commonly travel through a tunnel or passageway. In the same way, people experiencing IADCs sometimes go through a tunnel or passageway before meeting the deceased. NDEs and IADCs also share the description of a bright light at the end of the tunnel. People who experience IADCs somehow know that the deceased is in the light at the end of the tunnel and experience themselves as either moving through the tunnel, as moving through the tunnel with a sense of purpose or being drawn to it. However, I need to point out for those of you therapists who hopefully will end up doing this, generally, I would say probably 90% of the time, if a patient experiences himself in the tunnel, it's often because he or she is trying too hard. They're pushing. A lot of people in the tunnel get stuck. So what I generally do when that happens, I remind them it's not up to them to make the experience happen. Let the experience come to you. Let it happen. I remind them frequently during a session. Especially if they're in the tunnel, I remind them of that again. Or I might give them a set of eye movement just to relax, so they'll stop trying so hard. And if that's successful, if they're able to relax, okay, doc, I won't try this time, boom, then all of a sudden they're not moving through the tunnel, they're through. Meeting the deceased. In both NDEs and IADCs, the experience of meeting the deceased is a loving encounter. The only difference is that in NDEs, the conversation usually involves the issue of whether the NDE experiencer is to remain there or return to his or her body. In IADCs, the focus of the communication is usually on whatever grief issues the survivor brings to the experience. Sometimes the conversation involves issues the deceased bring to the experience as well. Beautiful landscapes. Beautiful landscapes are very common in both NDEs and IADCs, with picturesque trees, green hills, flowers, bushes, grass, shimmering lakes, and streams. Colors are typically brighter and richer, sometimes described as radiant. Both NDE and IADC experiencers say the environment exudes a feeling of peace and serenity, which is then transmitted to the experiencer. Sometimes people with expectations based on their religious beliefs are surprised by the rather earthly environment of their IADC experience. I guess they expected to be on a cloud with harps and so on and so forth. Life review. In the life review portion of the NDE experience, the person near death experiences his or her whole life in a very brief period of time. The life review typically includes a special focus on the feelings the person experienced during specific incidents, as well as the positive or negative feelings the others involved felt as a result of the person's actions. Those who have life reviews as a part of their NDE report that they are profound, life-changing learning experiences. They frequently developed increased empathy and interest in helping others. You know, I've never had a near-death experience, and so I haven't had a life review. But boy, I can just imagine experiencing all the feelings that I've caused in other people in my life. Some good, some bad. Right, Barb? I will pay for it, won't I? Barb's my wife. She forgot to say that when she interviewed. Wanted to see how the talk went first. This next thing I'm going to say is important. IADC experiencers do not experience their own life review or any portion of the deceased life review. However, the deceased are described as having been through a life review and as having learned from their mistakes, taking responsibility for their actions and becoming very interested in correcting whatever suffering or pain they caused in other people during life. All of our patients who have had both an NDE and IADC are convinced that the two experiences are essentially the same phenomenon experienced from different points of view. In every case, they report that the two experiences have the same qualities and psychological impact. These patients also believe with great certainty that both their NDE and induced ADC experiences tapped into the same source. I want to give you a case here of Nancy, who had had an NDE prior to her coming to see me. Nancy's pregnancy was uneventful until the 9th month, when she began vomiting and could no longer feel her baby's movement. An ultrasound revealed no fetal heartbeat, so labor was induced and her baby was delivered dead. During the induced labor, Nancy went into hypertensive shock and remained near death for 3 days. At some time during those 3 days, Nancy experienced an NDE in which she saw her mother, who had died a few years earlier. Her mother and the baby were standing, holding hands, seemingly very happy. Her baby was looking up at her grandmother, at his grandmother. Nancy told me that her mother said to her, "It's okay." Behind them, Nancy saw a bright, comforting light. Nancy was somewhat surprised that her baby was standing because he looked like the newborn he would have been had he lived. These events happened 6 years prior to our session. In spite of her NDE, she continued to experience grief over her baby's death, especially around the day that would have been her baby's birthday. After she explained what had happened, I described IADCs to her, or the procedure. Nancy was enthusiastic about giving it a try because her NDE had convinced her that such experiences were possible. After the IADC induction, Nancy closed her eyes. Very quickly, she reported that she saw her son with her mother, that she again saw her son with her mother, and they both looked happy and peaceful. However, there were some differences between her NDE and her IADC experience. She said her son looked older and much healthier than he did before. And instead of looking up at his grandmother, he was looking at Nancy and reaching out with both hands towards her. Nancy felt the two were moving away from her in her NDE, but had the clear sense that they were moving towards her in the IADC. There was also no bright light behind them in the IADC as there had been in her NDE. After her IADC, Nancy explained that her after-death communication was much clearer and more focused than her NDE. She also experienced her IADC as more comforting because of the sense that her mother and son were moving toward her, not away. At the end of the session, Nancy felt a much stronger connection with both her mother and son. She believed her grief had finally fully resolved. 7 months later, in a follow-up session, she said her grief was still fully resolved. She was convinced that her IADC was not merely a memory of her NDE, that the two were separate experiences tapping into the same source. The remarkable similarities between NDEs and induced ADCs suggest that they are closely related phenomena, likely from the same source. The fact that we can now reliably induce these experiences in a controlled laboratory setting provides us, for the first time, with the means to evaluate them in a more objective and scientific way. A number of competing beliefs and theories can now be put to a more rigorous test, and perhaps we can understand better the source and nature of these kinds of experiences. Something that people who've had the experience probably don't care much about, right? You know it's real. Okay. Now I'd just like to, I'm getting to the end here, and I'd just like to make some general statements about some things we've learned along the way. Since I purposefully induced ADCs about 7 years ago now, I've taught other qualified psychologists and psychotherapists to use the technique. My colleagues and I have induced nearly 3,000 very similar experiences. We found that we can induce the experience in approximately 98% of the people who agree to participate. We can induce the experience very rapidly, almost in one session. Although I'm kind of backpedaling on that. The actual induction procedure, starting with core focused eye movement, the actual induction procedure only takes 10 minutes. However, knowing that, I've invited people to come great distances to come in and have one of these experiences. Now, some of these people sat in traffic on I-94 for 2 hours, and they were thinking about what was going to happen, and they were imagining what their experience might be like, and so by the time they come in and sit in my office, they're like this, and I'm like, just relax, be receptive. The truck almost ran me off the road. So, I don't want to claim that you could come in and do this in one session. That's not a good idea. Really, the best way to do this is 3 sessions. The first session is I get to know you and you get to know me. For me to use the eye movement procedure on you, I need to know what I'm getting into. If you want to work on the death of your grandmother, but you've had a severe trauma in your life, what happens with eye movement is we might start to work on the death of your grandmother, but if you've got some unresolved trauma sitting there that you haven't dealt with, we're going to pull that right up. So I need to have I need to get a good history from you. I need to know what may come up during the course of this treatment, and so on. And I also need to explain to you how important it is to relax. ADCs are natural experiences. We don't induce the experience, we induce the state that allows these things to naturally occur. I remind people over and over again that most ADCs, in my experience, occur during sleep. People are fast asleep. They're not trying to do anything. They only happen when you stop trying. And the eye movement helps you do that. The IADC experience does not appear to be limited or altered by a patient's stage in the grieving process or the type of relationship with the deceased. The guy who thought it'd be a good idea to have me on Oprah asked me a good question in the back. Could you call Oprah for me, by the way?
I'll get an email.
My fantasy is to induce an ADC with Oprah live. She hasn't returned any of my phone calls or emails, though. And I've even had other people try to contact me. Here.
Oprah's grandmother. On the phone, it's Oprah's grandmother.
Well, we should have a phone handy then. The procedure seems to work with nearly everyone, and the results appear to hold up over time in every case. Again, I have no formal studies, but I probably have talked to probably between 400 and 500 people who had this procedure, and I see them from time to time. Some of them, go back as many as 7 years now, and in each case, they still report a feeling of a perception of reconnection and feeling good about it. It also doesn't seem to matter what the patient's beliefs are prior to the experience, as I mentioned before. The sense of connection with the deceased and resulting relief from the grief symptoms occur equally well for the devoutly religious of any faith, agnostics and atheists. It also doesn't seem to matter whether the loss was recent and the survivor is experiencing severe distress or whether it occurred many decades in the past, so the patient no longer is feeling any grief. That happens so many times when I work with a patient on a loss that's extremely distressing and they get a good result, and it's like, can I do my grandmother? Can I do my dog? And we do it. We have done dogs too. They don't talk though.
I understand.
They're still licking.
You said you knew where, what his name was, in Afghanistan. Got that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
When we met before, you said that you guys were messing around and you figured out that you could find out where some of them on.
That's top secret. I could get killed. Then I could get my NDE.
No, that's not needed.
Give it to the experience.
Perhaps most surprising is the fact that many patients do not have a personal relationship with the deceased. In some cases, combat veterans have reported connecting with an enemy soldier they had killed. In all cases, the experience is profoundly healing. Seems to be a reaction to that, so let me say a little bit more about that. At the time, the adaptive response in a combat zone is to get angry. Okay? I need to kind of digress on this a little bit. I can say I've never worked with a combat veteran who, as a result of basic training or boot camp, went to war ready to kill another human being. They're not ready. They're only ready after they've been severely traumatized themselves. Now they're ready. Because whether it's terror or deep sadness, this anger or rage is a better word, has now formed. One way of looking at their anger or rage response is a way of grieving. All right? At the time, after they've experienced their first trauma and they're ready to kill and they're angry and then they do kill, they feel exhilarated generally with the adrenaline rush and all of that. Their buddies are patting them on the back. Now this person can be trusted. He's one of us. Now, that's actually the smart way of doing it if you want to stay alive. That's adaptive given the crazy circumstances of a war zone. All right? Problem is, sometime later in life, sometimes when that anger no longer serves its purpose, the anger starts to give way, the guilt and the sadness start to emerge. Sometimes decades later. The soldier that one may feel glad he killed at the time, even exhilarated, now is starting to come up in nightmares. The look on the face, the look of fear in the enemy soldier before he was killed. Although that registered at the time, it was so covered up by the anger and rage, you didn't really experience it. But later in life, here it comes. Particularly that kind of close range kind of killing where the eyes connect. You can't help but not connect with another person's humanity, even though you may hate that person and want them dead at the time. But it oftentimes comes back. So what we do with helping combat soldiers deal with that is the exact same thing we do with other kinds of losses. We deal with the killing of an enemy soldier the same way we do with the loss of your best friend, which is you let yourself feel the sadness for the person you killed. And the IADC proceeds in the exact same way. It's interesting that, just to give you just kind of a general content or flavor of how this goes, generally it goes something like this. The patient takes to the experience, and by the way, I have them say what they want to say before I induce the experience, so all the issues are sort of clarified. I know what they are. They've had a chance to say what they want to say, I'm sorry, or whatever. So generally, the patients I work with are truly remorseful. They have tremendous guilt and sadness over what they've done. I don't work with psychopaths who still feel good about it or are still protected with their anger and rage. So these guys are truly remorseful. So what you do is we approach the sadness and then we induce the ADC. And generally the ADC, the deceased enemy soldier says something like, well, I'm okay. I'm okay where I am. And by the way, I was trying to kill you. You got the drop on me. And that sense of peace and forgiveness is then transmitted to the survivor. And it's real interesting that nearly always my veteran comes out of that experience saying something like, it's not just okay. I feel like he and I have a very important bond. Like we're friends now. And something that confuses them. I don't know why I'm feeling this way, but I guess it's based on what just happened. But I really feel like we're close. We have something important. It is important to note that the therapist does not lead the patient in any way other than to suggest that some form of communication with the deceased may occur. And that gets into the whole idea of the receptive state of mind again. Okay. After performing thousands of IADCs, we now know that certain themes are consistent in the experience. Number one, in a typical experience, the patient perceives the deceased as peaceful or happy. The deceased are almost always seen as smiling unless they are showing concern for the survivor. Those who are old and sick are experienced as young and healthy. And those with disabilities in life are no longer appear as impaired. The deceased also appear to be in a much better place, often with bright, comforting light and landscapes. As one patient remarked, she was in a beautiful garden, and it was the greenest green I had ever seen. People in landscapes are often described as radiant or surrounded by light. Most often, some form of communication also occurs, directed at helping the survivor with issues that he or she brought to the experience. And again, sometimes the concerns of the deceased are addressed as well. Apparently, as a result of having been through that life review I talked about before. We've IADC, bad guys. I had this one patient who's had a number of IADC experiences, and they were all wonderful and positive. And by the way, they're all wonderful and positive. There's not one exception. Out of 3,000, it's 100%. I had one patient who had a very abusive father, extremely physically and sexually abusive, and it went on for years. And the father abused him, my patient, and his two sisters repeatedly. He would even bring his drunken friends home, and they would take turns abusing his children. It was awful. He remembers being locked in closets for a day at a time. He hated his father. His hate for his father was eating him up. And I think for a whole year, I strongly encouraged him to IADC his father. He didn't want to. He didn't want to see the bastard. And I said, you don't see him for him, see him for you. Look what it's doing to you. But anyway, he eventually got around to it, got the courage to do it, and his father appeared to him. His father appeared to be in a dark area. Some of you, a similar kind of thing have come out of many NDE reports. People that we clearly consider to be bad guys in life are seen somewhat differently. The child who dies young, the grandmother that took care of everyone for a lifetime and was wonderful and never said a bad thing, never got angry in her life. People like that, children and grandmothers like that, are oftentimes experienced as surrounded by a beautiful radiant light. Either surrounded by it or sometimes coming out of the light, appearing out of it. The bad guys, you never see the light. And this veteran's father was in a very dark place. And as I expected, without leading the patient, the father was extremely apologetic. Matter of fact, the patient never experienced his father as being sincere about any feeling in his life at any time, and he experienced his father as being very sincere. To make a long story short, he felt much better. I don't think his anger was 98% resolved, but maybe, or 100% resolved, but almost always. I mean, almost completely resolved. It did take another session before it did resolve. But he asked his father why. And his father said, essentially, I don't remember the exact words, I don't have that recorded. Essentially that said something like, "I don't mean this as an excuse, but that's the way I was treated." And one of the biggest statistic in all of psychology that I'm aware of is people who abuse their children. Surveys range that between 94 and 98% of people who abuse were also abused. It gets passed on.
Did he ask for forgiveness, the father?
Yes, he did. And if I remember this right, he didn't forgive him in the first session. He came back a couple days later and did. He had to think about it. But he did go back and he did forgive his father. And a tremendous weight was lifted off my patient. Now, some people think, well, people like that shouldn't be forgiven. But it's for him.
How did he reach that forgiveness? How did your patient reach that?
Because he perceived his father as truly remorseful and truly hurt by what he had done. And again, apparently, what makes sense to me is his father had probably gone through an awful life review. Can you imagine going through his life review? All the pain and the ripple effects of that pain that you've caused in other people? You know, I don't believe in a hell, but some people say, well, what about Hitler? Hitler should be in hell. What about him? Can you imagine Hitler's life review? I don't know any more perfect justice. Anyway.
Question. Would a bad guy ever have light? Be in the light rather than in the darkness?
I've never had a patient experience a bad guy in the light.
Even after forgiveness?
Even after the forgiveness. Well, generally we're done at that point, and patients don't like to keep going back, particularly to a person like that. I mean, once they feel like they've forgiven and they feel better, you know, now they can separate for the first time. And they're generally not interested in going back. You know, another interesting thing is people who were, again, sort of on the bad end of things in life are often seen, this sounds weird, but I have to say it, doing very earthly kinds of activities. Playing basketball. Actually, I'd like that. I've been playing basketball. I would love to shoot baskets over there. Maybe they'd all go in. But playing basketball, riding motorcycles, stagecoaches, as opposed to just being in more kind of a garden, light, that kind of thing. They're more like very earthly.
They don't have a piece of contentment, it sounds like.
What's that?
They don't have a piece of contentment.
No, they don't. Right. It's like their level is still like this level. Yeah. I think you're still in. I think you move up over there too. Yeah, way back.
Just wondered if you had any experiences with people wanting to somehow help the evolution of those that have cats that are in that dark place. Have you had any experience with anyone wanting to help that person? Is there something, any connection that we can make helping the evolution of those people?
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, I got it. Have I ever worked with people who have had this experience to help people on the other side evolve? Is the question, right?
Yes.
I've never done it quite specifically as that, because as a psychologist, patients come to me for help. So my approach has always been to help them whatever issues they bring to therapy. Now, in the course of working with an abusive father like this, I think my patient did help his father make some movement over there. But we didn't go there with that purpose in mind. Although I would imagine that that's conceivable, what you're saying. Well, you know, another thing is let me just throw this out. People on the other side are busy. Don't ask me what they're doing. Other than the few things I just told you. One time, one of my vets ADC'd an officer who had died. He was very close, like a father figure. So in the ADC experience, he saw his friend holding a little girl's hand and walking away. And with his mind, he said, "Hey, look, I'm here." Something like that. And he turned around and said, "I'm busy now. We're going to a birthday party." And they left. We did come back later, and he was a little more welcoming. I've had some people, this is a very pleasant experience for the people I work with. And sometimes they want to just go back because it's fun. And the couple times I've tried that, we go back, and the deceased has said, "Why are you asking me that again? I already told you the answer." I've got to go. Typically, these experiences don't last any more than 10 or 15 seconds. If, as I said before, if not everything gets resolved with one induction that lasts 10 or 15 seconds, we can go back and bring it up again. But you can't cheat the system. If you're up to games, the deceased seem to know that. As a matter of fact, I have a good one for you. I was working with this vet. Here was his trauma. And again, I don't have this recorded from memory. He was in a situation in Vietnam where at their base camp he played basketball. This vet was white. And some of the people he played basketball with were black. And there was some racial tension. Blacks hung out with the blacks and the whites with the whites, and so on. Well, one day they had just got done playing basketball, and he stayed out there practicing his free throws or something like that, and the rest of the soldiers went into their barracks. At that time, they were hit by a rocket attack, and the barracks took a direct hit. So my vet goes running over there, and laying there on the floor with his guts blown wide open is one of these black soldiers that he had just gotten done playing basketball with. And he held this soldier in his arms, but as he did, he died. The soldier died. So we did the eye movement, we did the IADC, and the deceased person came to my vet and actually said, for a white guy, you weren't that bad. Meant basketball player. He wasn't as prejudiced as the others. But anyway, he said, "I'm okay, da 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 da." My patient apparently felt better and everything was resolved. And he got this frown on his face. And what's the matter? I never knew his name. It's so important for me to know his name. Can I go back and get his name? Well, we can try. I can't guarantee anything. So we did the induction again. Right then and there. Right. So he closes his eyes. He suddenly opens his eyes and frowns even more. I said, "What happened?" He said, "I know what." He said that the deceased person said, "Why do you want to know my name now?" And my patient said he saw right through me. I go, "What do you mean?" He said, "The only reason I wanted his name so I could put it on my VA record and I could get a higher level of compensation." He got his hand caught in the cookie jar on the other side. You can't fool him, I guess. So anyway, I guess you could say that was one experience that didn't end so positively. But over the next day, he was able to frame that as a learning experience. Raised his consciousness some. Yeah.
Is, you know what EMDR is like being used like in New York City for 9/11? And if not, why not?
Repeat the question.
Yeah. Is EMDR being used in the aftermath of 9/11? Is the question. A number of my EMDR colleagues went out there right after 9/11. However, when you're on the scene in a situation like that, you don't want to sit down and start providing EMDR. That's not your job on the front line like that. That's too much too quick. All right. Now, what's going on now? Of course, my colleagues have been home for some time now. They're not out there, but there are many EMDR trained therapists in New York. I would guess there's many thousands of them. I hope that survivors are finding those people. You know, it's so frustrating to have something like this and to see things on TV like that. I almost got in my car and drove there. And, you know, I couldn't get all these, critical incidents teams and, everybody's a member of something. I wasn't a member of anything. And I thought I'd just drive there and hang around on street corners, if nothing else. Say, hey, buddy, you want to try some eye movement? Or do drive-by eye movement. I just had no mechanism, no way of getting there to do that. I hope when my book comes out, I don't have a book yet, I have a new wonderful co-author, we've redone the proposal. The book is called Reconnections. I hope to get that big phone call in the next month or two, and I want to get it out there. My main job right now is really not to see individuals. That's not the best way for me to get it out. I need to get it out. That's my mission in life. I hate public speaking, but I have to do this. I have to get it out. What I see my role from here on is teaching other EMDR trained therapists how to do IADCs. That's my job. That's my job in life. Because the more of those people I train, then the more they go out and use it, and it gets out there. And I hope it eventually gets to those people. Yeah.
Do you have an explanation? You went into this a little bit in the beginning. Why does this work?
What? I'm sorry?
Why does this work?
Why does IADC work? I don't know. Why does the eye movement work? Well, I kind of went through that just real briefly, real quick before. It somehow speeds up the brain's ability to process information. It makes use of the brain's natural healing abilities. And we just speed it up. We just simply speed it up. So the brain heals itself.
Al, can I just say, from my own experience, when you did it for me, I would describe it to like a brain defrag, like, you on your computer screen, when you defrag your computer and you watch it. It was the experience itself is just very healing. It's something that I used to let it go. You let yourself go and you let it happen. And Al kept trying to talk to me, and I was actually kind of getting annoyed because it was such an experience that I knew something was going on. I wasn't even sure, but it was a processing experience that was took you to a wonderful place. So even if you don't have an IADC, EMDR has, I think, tremendous healing possibilities. Even therapeutic possibilities, the way we use a lot of alternative therapies now to help heal the body. It's a great brain massage.
What EMDR does is, we don't even know everything EMDR can do yet. It's so new. It's only been around, 10 or 12 years. I take tension headaches away every day with one set of eye movement.
What consists of a set?
One set of eye movement is the patient focuses on something moving in front of his or her face while at the same time accessing something, paying attention to something that's going on in their head. It can be an image, it can be a feeling of sadness, it can be both at the same time. It can be, when you're working with trauma victims, they're looking at this awful image and they're feeling tremendous sadness. And they have no trouble doing that. I mean, because it's right there. It's like, can you bring up that picture now? Of course I can. It's right here. And so then what you do is you get the brain processing while they're attending to whatever that is. And whatever that is they're attending to starts to move and process. Neuroimaging studies support eye movement treatment, at least in its initial phases. When a person thinks of the traumatic memory before eye movement, the limbic regions of the brain and the occipital lobes that have to do with visual memory light up, which is completely consistent with working with patients. They're in the moment, is that here and now fight or flight kind of thing, consistent with the lower part of the brain. They feel like they're right there and they're seeing all this stuff. After the eye movement, when they're asked to bring up the trauma, the frontal lobes light up. It's the abstract executive part of the brain. Now they're able to think of that memory in an abstract kind of way. Yes, it feels like 30 years ago, finally. It doesn't feel like yesterday. Yes, I remember it. We're not wiping it out of anybody's mind or memory banks. They remember it. It still might be sad. If you lost your best friend that day, on a scale of 10, it might be a 2 or a 3. It's still a sad event. But the reliving component is gone. Yeah, back there.
I really believe that the healing of the EMDR comes from beyond the brain, and they manifest in the brain as the result. That's my personal opinion.
I think you may be right. I think you may be right, especially given some of this stuff that's happening. It may be that we are actually treating the field, which then has an effect on the physical processes. Yeah.
We had a speaker a few months ago, Dr. Melvin Morris, who had done research and has identified a part of the brain associated with near-death experiences. And they found that they could stimulate that part of the brain and cause the experience in the same way.
Not the same experience. They could simulate an out-of-body experience, but not with all the components of the near-death experience.
Well, whatever the details might be, but it seems like maybe this eye movement might be stimulating some part. I mean, this seems like your research, you want to probably each be
Now, this isn't really responding to what you're saying. That's a good point. But, some people say, well, we have certain parts of the brain that seem to be related to these different components of the experience. And if you stimulate this part of the brain, you go through a tunnel, let's say, or see a light. Well, some people would then argue that that's a hallucination. That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm looking at Diane right now, and my occipital lobes are firing. That doesn't mean Diane's not real.
Right.
Maybe I'm looking at something.
Yeah.
Or
Just like you have a part
maybe someone's seeing a tunnel. Right.
I think it was Melvin Morris who said that what this research proves is that we are wired to have these experiences.
Right. The woman back there has been waiting.
I've been in therapy for about over 3 years now for PTSD. And I just want to ask you, one of the people at the clinic is quite familiar with EMDR, but they seem to feel, or did, as of a year ago, that I wasn't up to it, that it might do me more harm than good.
Yeah.
What sort of harm? They never really explained that.
Well,
Behavior, in my
there are two ways of looking at this. If I were to say that to somebody, that you're really not ready for this, it means you're not ready to go to the core. Whether your trauma is involved, has to do with loss or fear or terror, eye movement will help you if you're able and willing to go there and get eye moved once you're in the core. It'll work. Now, that's why I would say, I'm not sure why your therapist would say that to you. I know many outpatient therapists who are EMDR trained that don't use EMDR. And some of their reasoning may be good and some is not so good. One thing is all of my work is on an inpatient unit. When I do eye movement and I go home for the day, somebody's watching this guy. And if something kicks up, I get a phone call. I haven't gotten a phone call in many years because it works so well. But just in case, I feel okay. A lot of outpatient therapists, particularly those who are new to eye movement, and they're not quite sure of themselves, that coupled with the fact that they're not quite sure how you're going to respond might make them hesitate to move. You know, the last thing we want to do is cause harm, and we're very careful.
They're very impressive benefits. You got reservations about using money. You know,
Yeah.
never was made plain to me what might happen.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. I could only guess. I don't know. Yeah.
I've been involved in NLP for a number of years, and more recently ESM, which is part of thought field therapy. And I learned in NLP, eye accessing cues, which reminds me of the movements, the eye movements and things like that. And we had done an NLP, we'd get just a lot of healing with getting parts of the brain to communicate. And so it reminds me of when you're doing the eye movement that the whole brain is now communicating, one piece to another.
There's some reason to believe that the healing that comes with eye movement has to do with right-left brain integration, given the fact that it's bilateral stimulation, whether it's eye movement or tactile or auditory. But I just don't think we know yet. Yes?
How do you recommend finding a good therapist to do this if you wanted
To do EMDR or IADC?
Two questions.
Well, the question is really, where do you find someone to do IADC? Because that person will also know how to do EMDR. I wish I had business cards to pass out and say, give this number a call and we'll see you next Tuesday or whatever. This is so brand new that we're not even really up and running fully yet. I still have a day job I haven't left. I'm in the process of putting in for early retirement so I can devote more time to this. I've already have received requests from about 15 EMDR therapists across the United States who want to get involved. And again, that's my first choice. Well, I want to quit my day job and start training other people to do this. If the best thing to do is go to our website. It's www.induced-adc.com. I think it works without the hyphen too. www.induced-adc.com.
Write it on the thing there.
Hyphen that underscore.
Right.
So in other words, you per se are not available for private sessions as of now.
That's right. I'm just too busy. I'm too busy with this book, and we're actually putting a movie together, which is really not an ADC movie. It's a Vietnam movie with a whole different twist. And I'm just so busy. I have some of my colleagues are just as good as I am. So if you want to have this experience, you don't need to see me. This is very easily taught.
I was just reading it about the rapid eye movement. My friend came over and she was, going on a trip, but she was afraid to fly. She says, "Oh, Deb, let's try this."
Right.
And it worked.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't know not a darn thing about it, but it works.
It works. The amazing thing